Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. Pope Francis continues to be one of the most fascinating and misunderstood figures of our day. In a new biography, The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope, Austen Ivereigh discloses new facts about Jorge Bergoglio, his election, and his background in Argentina, which is where we started our spirited interview. Take a look. You have a quote, you said, he would come to respect Peronism as the expression of the values of ordinary people. What of that respect do you see in this papacy?
He's always rooted himself in what he calls God's holy faithful people. The ordinary people, not the elites, not the educated, not the rich, but the ordinary believing poor. And Peronism, as a political party, as a political movement, has been a bit of a disaster often, and he's opposed it. But Peronism spoke to and articulated those values of the children of migrants, the Catholics, who looked back, to the Spanish tradition rather than to other countries.
And Juan Perón was also a populist.
He was, and in many ways, I draw the analogy in the book, because in many ways they have a lot in common.
Yeah.
Both speak very clearly to people, they have a warm bond with people, they understand and relate to ordinary people.
Yes.
And in fact, in many ways, both rule very personalistically and so on.
That's true. That's true. And they both know how to work a balcony. But
right.
I want to raise a question here about Cardinal George before his retirement of Chicago. He raised a few questions, and I thought it would be interesting to have you react to these questions, in that you've spent so much time now researching and watching this man up close. Why doesn't he clarify these ambiguous statements that he makes? Cardinal George asked on his way out of office. Why doesn't he do so? And I imagine he's thinking about who am I to judge, which has been taken out of context and used in innumerable ways. The call to that divorced woman in Argentina who was divorced and remarried, and he said, go ahead to communion. Why not come out and clarify those things?
There's a tension, maybe even a contradiction in this Pope, in that he wants to be able to continue to be a pastor. He wants to be able to speak to people very directly. And actually, when he's speaking to that person, the only thing that matters to him is that other person. In that sense, he's a real pastor. He's present to that person and doesn't, in a way, care about what other people think or know or how they might interpret them. Yeah. Now, one might say, as a pope, he's no longer should be doing that. He needs to realize he can't. But it's, I think, vital for him to be able to retain that as pope, because he does consider himself now the world's pastor. Before, he was Argentina's pastor before that. Do you know what I mean? But he remains a pastor. Yeah. So some of the ambiguity now when he says, who am I to judge, when he said on the plane, actually I thought the whole quote wasn't ambiguous. He was quoting from the Catechism. Yeah. But it was interpreted, wasn't it, through a particular filter.
Correct.
I think he's used to being misinterpreted, and at one level he's not bothered.
Yeah, no, he's clearly not bothered by it. And this is Cardinal George's next question was, does he not realize the repercussions for clergy, for bishops, for the people who have to then, the middle managers who have to go out and carry the message forward?
Maybe the problem is that we've got a bit used to a church that we think is built for clarity. What he wants is a church built for mission, that can evangelize, that can take the church outside the choir. You know that famous speech he gave on the eve of the Conclave, which so impressed the cardinals, and he said, Jesus is on the door, usually understood to be outside knocking in. In fact, he thinks we've got Jesus tied up in the sacristy and he's knocking to be let out. So I think this is what he wants. He wants to take the church out. Now, that means mess, disorder, misunderstanding, ambiguity sometimes, because when you take the church into people's lives, that's what, in many ways what he's doing is bridging the gap between the real church, of the frontier, of the parish, and Rome.
But isn't part of the papal function to provide clarity? He is Peter, who stands up and says, no, this is what it is. This is what we believe. This is where we go.
Clarity is good, and clarity converts, and clarity is obviously a virtue, and or indeed the Pope must teach clearly, the Church must teach clearly. But maybe sometimes if we say that clarity is all that we're about, then maybe we're missing out something else. I think what he's doing is actually fulfilling or filling out Church teaching, to say it isn't just what the Church says is true, it's also that the Church is the means of people coming into contact with a loving, merciful Church and God.
Yeah. Let's talk about a few of the contradictions, and one that I have seen over these now almost 2 years. The Pope clearly wants to have a more consultative episcopal experience, where we bring people in. The Synod on the Family is a good example in not one but two parts. It's clear that he wants that conversation and that group discussion and group think. At the same time, he's choosing with deliberateness the people who will draft that message, write that message, and we saw what happened at the Synod on the Family. Do you think he's aware of that tension? And does that undermine his consultative intention by sort of jimmying the process?
I was at the Synod, and I'm not sure I accept the reading of it. We can come back to that in a minute. I think what he was doing with the Synod, what he is doing with the Synod, is saying we must look at some of these very difficult pastoral questions. We must live in the tension, which is humanly very hard to do. How do we uphold the indissolubility of marriage while at the same time coming alongside those whose marriages have broken? Now, those questions are not easy, but they were left us by Christ. I mean, Jesus treated the adulteress not just as a sinner, but as a victim in need of healing. So he left us that tension, and we've got to live in that tension. Now, he is confident, and I think I show in my biography that actually his whole life, intellectually and spiritually, has been about this, has been how does the church develop its understanding? How does it develop in through time and in the world? And you do that by living in tension and by inviting the Holy Spirit in. And over time, if you give it time and you're faithful, then new creative possibilities and solutions will open up. So I think that's what he was trying to do with the Synod. Mm-hmm. Why did he get Cardinal Kasper to make that address to those cardinals at the beginning of it? Because actually Cardinal Kasper presents the problem. You know, how do we have a more merciful church? How do we... Yeah? And so he wasn't saying, this is what I want to happen. He was saying, he allowed Kasper, as it were, to shake things up.
Yeah.
And then he's asking the church to sit in that tension for a year, confident that if there's a convergence at the end of it, and there may not be, but if there's a convergence at the end of it, that actually we can be confident that the Holy Spirit has acted through that process, just as it did in the early church with early church councils.
Well, in the early church councils, we also had bishops popping each other across the mouth, which frankly I'd love to see.
And does that matter? I mean, obviously I'm not...
To me it does. It's great TV. Sure it matters. Yeah, my ratings go...
I'm not advocating intra-episcopal violence, but on the other hand...
So look, St. Nicholas was even imprisoned because he was, throwing the punches.
Pope Francis himself said this, actually, to the clergy in Caserta. He said, I prefer that we're throwing punches than that we're pretending that we all agree.
But he doesn't prefer that.
Honest disagreement is fine.
He came out afterward and said he was annoyed that these bishops were talking out of school and talking about what was happening in the Synod. So he didn't say that, Austen. Afterward, he said exactly the opposite.
No, what he was concerned about was, if you like, the politicization of the Synod, where you get divided into parties and all the rest of it. He dislikes that because he sees that as division. The difference is divine, but division is diabolical, is one of the phrases he's used. Now, what's the difference between the two? The difference is that there's nothing wrong with honest disagreement, but the problem is that once you start to adhere to your ideas and reject somebody else's, then you've fallen into division. It's all about how you manage that process of discernment. He's a good Jesuit, right? And so, honest disagreement, but not parties.
I want to talk about the conversations with Eugenio Scalfari, this atheist editor and founder of the great Italian newspaper,
La Repubblica.
La Repubblica, and they have had repeated conversations. But coming out of that, the Vatican has pulled down the articles. They've had to clarify and correct. Why does he continue to talk to this man? I realize, and I've read, you and others have written, he's more interested in that individual and he thinks he's engaging Scalfari. Fantastic. Engage him over tea and scones. Why are you doing it in a public way that invites misinterpretation? And indeed, there is a pattern and series of it now.
I've been a communications professional in the church as well as a journalist, and believe me, I asked the same question. I mean, how could he have sat down with this 90-year-old atheist who didn't even have
Didn't take notes,
no recording? The guy then writes it up, apparently gives it to Pope Francis. Francis says, okay, I don't need to read it, I trust you. And then the thing goes out, and of course it's full of distortions and full of things he never said. Does he not realise? I think the answer is, and I have spoken to many people, it's not just about the relationship with him. I think the dialogue, the relationship that he's built up with Scalfari, and the way that through Scalfari he can speak to people who don't know the church and who are outside the church. That's the valuable thing. See, the secret to him is he's a master builder of bridges. He builds bridges beyond the boundaries of faith, politics, culture, and he believes that the Holy Spirit, that God acts through those bridges, and that his job as Pope is to open up those spaces. Now, if he were too preoccupied with, accuracy and making sure that everything was absolutely clear, that would make it more difficult to build those bonds of friendship. Does that make sense?
It does, but at the same time, he's the Pope, and
I know.
Confusion is the problem. People read this and they're confused. The faithful are confused, and the people who I think he's trying to engage, they're similarly confused. So I don't see how that furthers if that is indeed his goal, how it connects there.
Because I think you're still perhaps attached to this idea of a church built above all
Not
for
a
clarity.
church, people being clear.
But is there anything that Scalfari said that Francis said? I mean, he got a lot of things wrong that were clearly inaccurate. But what was the impact of that? Has church teaching been in any way changed or modified by that?
No, but I think as you referenced in the book, you say, and I'm going to quote you because I think it's a good quote. You say at one point that there are those who believe Francis's radicalism is not to be confused with a progressive doctrine or ideology. But that sort of interview invites this misinterpretation of who I see. The man I see is the man you portray in the book, who I do think is thinking outside the box, engaging media and people who would never have given the church any time of day. Suddenly they're engaged, they're listening. The downside of that is it does invite this misunderstanding,
yes.
Does it not?
It does, and I think I can't defend what Pope Francis did on the Scalfari interview. I think what I'm trying to do is understand it.
Yeah, me too.
In terms of his life, and definitely back when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, phoning people, for example, and then they would later, of course, give an account of that phone call, and sometimes go on radio, and say, well, and would he react? Would he act to correct it? No. Why? I spoke to his advisors. They would say, because at one level he said, I said what I said. If that person then wants to use it in some way, that's up to them. I know what I've said. It's a different way of thinking. It's an extremely unpolitical way of thinking.
Well, as a pope, it's a hard way because you're basically, when the pope speaks, one assumes this is the law. He is teaching us what we are expected as Catholics today to do and live. And when he says these things on the phone, even though he's intending it just for that woman, the world now knows, is that the message? Can we just ignore local pastors and the bishop?
Okay, but is it
because of that phone call?
But is it just what the Pope says? Is the Pope a vehicle for church teaching, or is the Pope a model of Christ?
He's both. He's both.
But is the way he acts and the way he is actually just as powerful, indeed as important? I mean, this is a Pope who actually speaks through actions and through his warmth, and has had a massive impact. Sure. The kissing of the man with neurofibromatosis, inviting women to breastfeed in the Sistine Chapel, inviting homeless in for breakfast, including their dog. These things have made a profound impact on people.
No, beautiful gestures. And John Paul II, I mean, I'm old enough to remember, he did the same thing. I mean, it's not like this is the first time we've had a Pope engage people and kiss babies. I mean, this has happened for decades.
Of course not.
And I heard a beautiful story about Pope Francis just the other day. A Monsignor I know in Rome was on his way to visit his dying mother. She's dying of cancer in London. He receives a phone call on the way to the airport, and it's Pope Francis. And he says, the first thing I want you to do is to give her my blessing and tell her I'm praying for her healing. Please do that. I'm commanding you to do that. The impact that this left on this man, and he said the tenderness, he regarded me with the tenderness of a mother, is what he told me.
Which is what he does.
Which is lovely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lovely
And that is him. He has the tenderness of a mother, and maybe that's the most important thing about him, rather than that he teaches clearly. He's not a theologian, he's not a philosopher. Unlike John Paul II, unlike Pope Benedict, he's above all, and he's an extremely clever man, but in a sense for him, ideas are not the most important thing. It is the heart. He acts from the heart. Sometimes, therefore, leaves things. But I think he's pretty confident that there are quite a few people ready in the Vatican and commentators, like you and me, who can clear up ambiguities on his behalf when necessary.
Yeah, well, as Cardinal George said, why should we be in the cleanup crew? And that's true. I feel awkward having to. What do I know? None of us are in his mind. None of us can explain away these things.
We know what the Church teaches.
Of course we do. But if the Pope seemingly is saying something counter to that, and the Vatican doesn't correct it, the woman says, he told me, as a divorced and remarried Catholic, I can go to communion. That's what he told me. Who am I to then say, you can't do that? Now I look like the hater, right?
No, what we have
and
to...
so do you.
No, what we have to do, and it's very simple, we say, actually, this is what the Church teaches, these are the rules, right? And you can be sure that the Pope has not contradicted those. You can be sure. And he never... I mean, I've been through his life, I spoke to the people who work with him, he often did make those calls. And I said, in fact, to his press advisor after that famous call, I said, he said, no way, he would never, ever have contradicted Church teaching.
Let's move on to the conclave. You report some new details here that I found fascinating. You contend in the book that your former boss, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, Cardinal Casper, Cardinal Gottfried Daniels, Karl Lehmann, that they conspired is too hard a word, that they collaborated to whip up votes in the conclave to support Bergoglio. Since your book came out, your former boss and others have denied this account, but they really took issue with one little phrase. Not that they were whips, but...
Right. They're not disputing that they went around urging their fellow cardinals to vote for Cardinal Bergoglio. That's quite normal at conclaves.
Yeah.
I mean, how else do popes get elected?
They have people who whip votes up.
Well, yeah, whip up votes, exactly.
Candidates.
Yes, and they suggested and so on. And usually, before you go into a conclave, actually, a cardinal needs to have quite a lot of support in order then to become pope, because getting from that first ballot to the last one, there's usually only 4 or 5 ballots. What Cardinal Cormac objected to was a particular line in my account where I said that what I wanted to say was, unlike 2005, because they also wanted him elected then, this time they thought he'd be willing, but rather than say they thought he'd be willing, I said they sought his consent. Now that implies that they actually went to him and said, would you be willing to be a candidate? Now that would be forbidden by conclave rules. I knew that didn't happen, and I'm really sorry. I have apologised publicly for the misunderstanding that's caused. And actually, even the ebook now carries a different line, and that will be corrected in future reprints. But the account that I give of those cardinals wanting him to be elected and urging other cardinals to elect him, that is true.
You said that they had learned lessons, this group of cardinals, from 2005. What was that lesson?
Well, the lesson was, I think, in 2005, they had wanted to vote for him, and a lot of votes, of course, did go in his direction. But they didn't, as it were, sound him out, either directly or indirectly. They didn't, as it were, do their homework. Right. In fact, Cardinal Bergoglio, in my account, was convinced in 2005 that neither he nor the Church, the Latin American Church, was ready for the papacy. And it's one of the revelations in the book, actually, is how much it wasn't just about a man, but about a whole church. And he didn't want to be seen as an anti-Ratzinger candidate. And so, anyway, all I meant was that they didn't do, if you like, much of their background. Yeah. This time in 2013, they were much more prepared, much more ready. They'd done much more thinking, and they were convinced that this time he wouldn't resist.
And it was his time.
Yeah. And he, of course, he had become aware that it was his time as well.
Where is this pontificate going? I mean, Benedict, it was clarity, it was restoration of the liturgy. John Paul, it was human dignity, the cry of human dignity in the human person around the globe. What will be the through line of this pontificate? Some still can't see it, many can't.
If there is to be one thing that this papacy will be remembered for, it is initiating a reform not just in structures, but in the way that the Church is seen and perceived, above all, by the non-Catholic world. That, if you like, a church of the first week of the spiritual exercises, not just the second week. Church as mother and healer and lover, as well as clear teacher. And I think we need to get used to both.
The Great Reformer, Francis and the Making of a Radical Pope, is available at bookstores everywhere and online.